And one of the flavours that's good for damp or helps to get rid of dampness and get rid of heat is the bitter flavour. Tea and coffee also have a bitter flavour. Another food's bitter melon. It's incredibly bitter. It's probably the most bitter flavour. Asparagus. Asparagus is a really good food to help get rid of damp. Hi, welcome to Foods to Avoid and Foods to Eat for Damp Heat Conditions. My name is Marie Hopkinson. I'm a Chinese herbalist and an acupuncturist. I've been practicing Chinese medicine for more than 20 years this year. It makes me feel old saying that. But I have been, and I have had lots of experience in teaching Chinese medicine, teaching Chinese diet therapy as well, which is one of the 5 branches of Chinese medicine. So today's video, we're going to be talking about foods to avoid and foods that you can have to help someone who's got damp heat. If you haven't watched the first video already, click on that one that talks about what is damp heat and how can I get rid of it, or how can I treat it, or what is it? How does Chinese medicine think about damp heat, and what are the symptoms of damp heat? So the first thing that you want to think about is not what foods to have, right? It's really what foods to avoid, or what kind of diet what things should I eliminate? So by taking those things out, I understand that if that is your pure diet, then you're like, whoa, what do I eat, Marie? Just air? Do I just have water? But we just want to start with that basis. So these are the things that will definitely hinder you from getting better if you've got dampness or damp heat. So the first one is too much dairy, and pretty much the rich kinds of dairy. So if you love dairy and you think, oh, I can't avoid all dairy, Marie, I don't want to do that. Well, then I would avoid cream. I would avoid thicker, richer types of cheeses. I did even make a video about what kind of cheese you could have for dampness. We did a cheese lineup, so you could click on that video and watch that if you love cheese. All kinds of cheese tend to have a dampening effect. So if you've got heat with the dampness, so damp heat, I would try to avoid the cheese as well. So fermented dairy is the lesser of the two evils, if you like. So yogurt, Greek yogurt kind of thing would be better. And particularly you want to avoid things where there's added sugar. So that's the second thing. The second one would be sugar. If you can eliminate sugar out of your diet, you're going to eliminate a huge amount of foods that combine like either sugar and salty, or they combine sugar and carbs. And those are the main perpetrators for dampness. Certainly fried foods, you want to avoid that, right? Anything that's deep fried, you want to avoid that deep frying. That is not so great for damp heat. Like that's one of the foods to avoid. Now, the added one for damp heat that's particularly needed to avoid is alcohol, and particularly the beer and the Guinness type of alcohols. If you were to put all the alcohols on a scale, and maybe I'll do a separate video about this, but in general, the more dampening alcohols are the ones that are made out of grains, so Guinness being the worst, then it would be beer. And then in the middle, the thing that sits the best in terms of like the pH of your body and the metabolism of your body is red wine. White wine tends to be on the more towards the dampening side and the less heating side. And then your spirits go into the more heating side. So if you have damp heat, it makes sense that you need to avoid dampness and you need to avoid heat, and that's why it's really difficult to get rid of damp heat if you're drinking a lot of alcohol. So certainly if you've got an acute situation of damp heat, which often can be caused by drinking alcohol, like if you go on a weekend bender and you have way too much alcohol, particularly guys who drink a lot of beer tend to have really very stinky bowels after that kind of stuff, and they think, oh, that's normal, that's just my brother used to call it his after grog bog or something. I'm just like, that's dampness and that's damp heat. If it really stinks, it's damp heat. So that would be the first thing, is to kind of avoid the dairy, particularly dairy and sweet. The second one is sugar, avoiding any kind of sugar combinations with sugar and salt or sugar and sweet. And then alcohol, right? So that if you can avoid those things, then you think, well, what else, what should I eat? So if you have an acute situation of damp heat, which means it only just happened and you want to try to treat it with diet, lifestyle things first, then you would go on to what we call a clear, bland diet. In Chinese, they call it the Qing Dan diet, right? So clear, bland means literally foods that are clear, like you can see through the soup. It's a clear soup. So the essence of the foods is there, the nourishment of the foods is there, but not the kind of like the thick, stodgy, hard to digest kind of things. So a good way to think about what foods should I have to avoid damp is when you cook something up, the thicker and the creamier it gets, the more that food has a propensity to cause damp. the thinner the liquid that's created when you cook that, then the easier it is to digest and the more towards a clear, bland diet it is. Now, I know that's not a meal plan. I know that's hard for some people to imagine that. But the good thing with Chinese medicine is it's not an either or thing. It's not like, oh, you could never have dairy, or you should never have alcohol, you should never have this or that. It's a balance of things, right? And it's good to know the principles and the ideas about how to think about the food so that you can think about it for yourself and you can think, is this a good thing for me to have? It's not necessarily that one food in isolation. It's that food in the context of whatever else you're eating. So let's say you think, oh, look, I don't want to give up alcohol, right? You just want to have some here or there, moderate amount, but you've still got this damp heat problem. If you had a purely Qing Dan kind of diet, like you had clear soups as the main part of your diet and very clear watery types of vegetables without too much rich sauces on them, things like that, not much grains, not too much pasta, like you had maybe rice or barley as a grain, but not, made into pastas or those kinds of processed foods, then you probably could have alcohol here or there without too much detriment to your body. But if you're having a lot of richer foods, like you have pasta every day, you have packet foods, you have snack packet foods. I know some people that just they have muesli bars all the time, all these kinds of things. They have a cake every day or a piece of cake, not a whole cake every day, but a piece of cake. They have a chocolate bar, this kind of stuff. So you're having a lot of dampening foods anyway, and then if you add alcohol on top of that, well, then you might notice a much more massive kind of detriment to your body. Or cheese platters or things like that, So it's about the context. It's about the context of the food, not so much the one food in isolation. So that would be the first thing. So if you avoid those kind of dampening foods, and then you think, okay, now I'm going to try to build my diet around a clear, bland diet. So this is what I would suggest that you do: is one, make a big soup every week, a veggie soup you could use a chicken stock or a beef stock if you want to, or you could just make it as a veggie soup. So things like using celery. These sort of foods that have a type of a draining damp effect on your body, right? So because they're clear and bland, they're easy to digest. So cabbage is one of the best ones for that. And when you cook it, you definitely wouldn't want the cabbage raw if your digestive system's weaker and hard to digest. So you'd want to either sauerkraut, like a fermented cabbage, or you'd want it to have it as a cooked cabbage, not coleslaw, because you don't want the mayonnaise and all this kind of rich stuff, right? So having some kind of soup. Now, if you're not overweight, let's say, you could just have a more carby kind of a soup. You could even have potato, you could have sweet potato, you could have pumpkin, something like that. So I understand if you think, well, it's the middle of summer. Like for me, it's 33 degrees, 35 degrees today in Perth, 95 Celsius, right? It's hot. You're not thinking about soup. I'm not thinking, oh, I'd love that hearty, I'd love to have that hearty soup for dinner. But you can cook up the soup once a week. Sometimes what I do is I just freeze it in little cups in the freezer, and then you can use that as a stock to cook with your other foods, or you can just use it as a soup, especially if you're just a one person at home and you're kind of well, what do I use for my meal plans and what do I use to eat? I don't want to have to cook up a whole soup every day or something like that. So that's one option, right? You can make the soup just once a week, that kind of thing. And then what you could put with it is some freshly steamed vegetables. You could have some steamed, all of your leafy green vegetables are great, right? So broccoli and even things like the white vegetables like cauliflower, lotus root is really good for your digestive system. It's easy. It's a clear, bland kind of food, right? It's crunchy and that's one of the foods I like to put in stir fry, that kind of thing. So often with these meals, it's not so much the actual foods you're consuming with them, but it's just the absence of these richer kind of sauces, right? And these richer things that are added to them, okay? And then if you're a meat eater, you can have your meat. Now, you'll hear some people say with damp heat, you've got to avoid meat because meat's heating. Again, it's what you put with the meat and it's how much you have of it. So if you're having rich, heavy kind of meats with sauces on them, that will make that already warming meat more warming. But if you look at someone on a keto diet, and this is probably the good test of time to think about it, which predominantly, you can do ketosis with vegetarian, or vegan even, but let's say you're most people who go into ketosis or go into a keto diet and have meat, they tend to not be they don't have dampness as a side effect, right? That's not a common thing, right? It's not a common thing to have damp heat as associated with that. It's more common for your bowels to become drier, right? For your bowels to become more constipated, because that heat of that meat is kind of warms the digestion, but it's not enough warmth to kind of create the damp. I would argue, because I've seen other people make videos on this, and because it's in the Chinese medicine textbooks, it's in these kind of books that float around on diet therapy, and I've taught this. But not only do I I don't just teach out what I read out of books, because these books are not old texts; they're modern texts. Sometimes it's not that food in the isolation, it's that food in the context of the dishes and the way that we're having it. And particularly for a Westerner, like burgers, there's meat in burgers, right? That doesn't make it okay to have the burger. Like, burgers are so dampening and so causing damp heat, because you've got rich sauces, you've got the heat of the meat, which is, it is warming. And then you've got this, all this sugar and salt and all the carbs in the bun and all the process that's happened to it. So I've said this before on this channel like, it's the processing, it's the levels of processing that cause the damp. So if you can think about that when you're making your foods, how close to how further away from the packets and how close to the original foods can I get? Because then you won't be having all these added things that sometimes you don't even realize are in there. Like, you look at a packet sauce and you think, look, I'm in a hurry, I've got to quickly make something, so I'm going to chuck on a pasta and put this sauce on top of it. Look, and I'm saying this because this is how this is what I eat sometimes, right? You're busy and you think, I'd just like a pasta, I'd just like to quickly make a pasta. But if you make that sauce from scratch, it doesn't have the same taste. And the problem is we get used to this rich, saucy tastes that come from these things that, have a lot of additives and things like that in there. And when you make them from scratch, you'll see what those additives are, right? You'll be like, oh, okay, you need chicken stock to kind of make it have this rich, intense kind of flavour. Okay, well, what are the properties of these kinds of things? And that's sort of a good way to think about your body. Now, another thing I want to introduce you to is the idea of the 5 flavours in Chinese medicine. And one of the flavours that's good for damp, or helps to get rid of dampness and get rid of heat, is the bitter flavour. Now, you don't often think of bitter flavoured things as a yummy, delicious food because they usually aren't the culinary go-to kinds of foods. But I'll talk about some of these bitter foods, or foods. Often vegetables have a bitter flavour and they have another flavour with them. So we'll go through a list of some of these bitter foods that you might be able to incorporate into your diet if you have the damp heat or you have dampness. So some of these foods include artichokes. Now, not artichokes marinated in a lot of oil, just the pure artichokes. So you'd have to cook them and we'll get rid of a lot of that oil. So if you're eating all that, those delicious artichokes that are coated in oil, that's not what we're talking about here. Asparagus. So asparagus is a really good food to help get rid of damp, and you'll notice that because it increases your urination. Bamboo shoots. Bamboo shoots are good if you have a problem with bulking your intestines. So let's say you are on a keto diet and you find that you need to bulk your intestines a little bit, like you need that fiber. So bamboo shoots are good for that. Also, like mushrooms and funguses tend to have a bitter flavour in them. So particularly black fungus, which you can buy from the Oriental food shops. It comes in a dried packet, and you soak it in water, and then now it's very rubbery, and it's something that you'd have to cut up very finely, or sometimes you can buy it already cut up, and then you put it into your soups. You can put it into miso soup, you could put it into your weekly soup that you make if you want, or you can put it into stir fries and things like that. That's a good one to kind of have. Another food's bitter melon. Now, if you've ever had bitter melon as a food by itself, it's incredibly bitter. It's probably the most bitter flavour. And if you can stomach having it, like I would just have a little bit of bitter melon with your meal and just get it down. It's not a delicious flavour. And in Indian cuisine, it's used quite a lot in curries. Now, why do they use it in curries? Because that bitter flavour has a kind of cooling effect, and if you have this really hot curry, you kind of don't notice the effect of the full taste of that bitter melon. They often use it. It's If you can't find where to buy it, you can sometimes buy it from these Indian food shops, like the Oriental shops. There's some Indian food shops I know in Australia that I've seen them. I'm sure that you have them on other sides of the world, where they sell these kind of things. And in the freezer section, they'll often have this frozen bitter melon. But you can buy it from the supermarket and the grocery stores as well. Bok choy, broccoli, cauliflower all have an element of a bitter flavour. Now they have other flavour with them, which makes them much more palatable, but these kind of vegetables are really good for you like that. Celery, chard, Chinese mustard or mustard greens have a bitter flavour. Most green vegetables have a bitter flavour. So all of your lettuces, your spinach and these kinds of things. And because they're leafy green, right, they disintegrate very easily. So they're much more having a cooling effect and they're much better for kind of summer time. So I'm not suggesting when you have damp heat to go and have a lot of cold foods. It's a bit of a catch-22. You don't have to necessarily bombard your body with coldness to get rid of the heat. You want to enable your body to digest things properly so that your body gets rid of the heat. You don't want to just sort of flush all this coldness into your body to, mitigate that heat, if you like. Leeks are a good one. Leeks and mushrooms. You could cook those two together. That sounds good. Tea and coffee also have a bitter flavour. Now, I've made a couple of videos about tea and coffee for dampness, and I'll just give this a little bit of a mention. So in this case, as a beneficial food, it would be in a small quantity, like as in 1 shot of coffee or 1 cup of tea, or you could probably have about 2 or 3 cups of tea to 1 shot of coffee, like I'm talking about 1 shot of espresso. It would be without milk. If you add milk to it, it's not helping your dampness. It's not helping, it's actually making that worse. Any kind of milk, whether it's nut milk or anything like that. But bitter has a purgative effect, right? So one of the flavour effects of the bitter flavour is it descends. So if you've got dampness, you generally want it to get out of your body. And so that descending action, this is why a lot of people have a bitter drink after a heavy meal. Or Italians would often have a coffee after the end of a heavy meal. So even if they've been drinking alcohol, they might have a coffee to kind of have that purgative effect to help your body, then digest all those heavy kind of foods that you've had. So how does coffee work in terms of dampness? Well, because on one hand, it can help with the damp because that bitter purgative effect. But if you have too much of it, it will end up generating more damp, right? And certainly more heat. So coffee tends to be warming when you first have it because it is warm, but it comes from a bean, and beans have a purgative effect and they can have a detrimental effect if you have too much of beans. So any kind of beans, and that purgative effect tends to be very cooling after a while. So it's kind of a weird conundrum food because it has a different effect if you have 1 coffee shot, let's say, versus 2 or 3 coffee shots. And certainly coffee has a much greater detriment for people with dampness if you have it with milk versus just having it black. So I hope that's been useful and helpful to you to kind of think about different kinds of food. So the main advice would be, number 1, avoid the foods I said to avoid at the start. So avoiding the alcohol, avoiding the rich foods, anything where there's sugar combined with it, you want to kind of avoid that, right? Anything where there's rich and creamy kind of dairy, you want to kind of avoid that. And then the alcohol is the heating food. Now, another heating food that's mentioned sometimes with damp heat is spicy foods, right? So avoiding too much hot and spicy. You can have some pungent, which is the precursor to the spicy, let's say. Because pungent enables the qi to move, right? And that's what it does. It moves the flow, right? And you want that flow to be moving. You certainly don't want more stagnancy when you've got dampness. But if you move the flow so much that you kind of break into a sweat, then that's too much kind of heating for you. And if you look at your bowel, so if you've already got diarrhea with hot diarrhea and you have a lot of curry, then you're just going to have even more hot diarrhea, right? So it depends on how much your tolerance for curry and your tolerance for hot, spicy foods is. Often, again, what causes that problem isn't so much the chili itself. Like if you were just to munch down, I'm not suggesting you do, but if you were just to eat some raw chili or add that chili into a stir fry, let's say, the way that it's going to act in your body is different if it's in a richer, because a lot of curries have a richer sauces. So they have like coconut milk. It can be quite dampening if it's or coconut cream if you have a lot of it, or if it's, you know, if you're combining that kind of, if it's combined with sweet, because it is a sweet kind of flavour. So that would be my main advice. Now I know that the person that asked for this video said, Marie, could you give me some meal plans? Could you give me some advice? What could I have? So I would advise you to make a soup and try to have that soup, especially if you're in, you know, the other side of the world to me and it's winter time for you. Well, soups are a great thing to have. If you're in a hurry and you think, what can I have at work? You could either make soups. Sometimes what I do is I make a whole bunch of frozen meals and I take them to my work and I just leave them in the freezer there, right? So that's convenient. Some works have that. If you don't have that, you don't have a microwave or anything to heat things up, then you can use miso soup, which is like a sachet, kind of like a paste that you use, and then you do that. And you can mix your soup with salad, right? So you can have salad with some cooked meats, right? And that'll be kind of combining the warm and the nourishing parts of foods with the cooling effects of those salads. So yeah, that's better. And certainly soup and salad, or soup and some cooked meat, even if the cooked meat's gone cold, like you've got some cooked chicken breast, or, you know, some cooked steak and you've cut that up, or something along those lines, or even some ham or something like that. It's better than you know, a lot of processed foods in a sandwich, let's say. Okay, so it's like, what you want to do is try to work your way towards the best options possible. Now, if you have cured meats like ham and things that are very salty, those things tend to not be so great for dampness. So I try to avoid like bacon and, you know, ham if you can, that's, you know, been processed, because there's a lot of salty flavour in that, and that processing makes it harder to digest it. But if it's just here or there, you know, those are kind of, you know, okay foods to have. And certainly if you've gone from having, you know, heavier meals or pasta or something like that, or takeaway foods, like where you're just like, oh, I'm getting a burger and chips. Certainly fried foods, you want to avoid that, right? Anything that's deep fried, you want to avoid that deep frying. That is not so great for damp heat. Like, that's one of the foods to avoid. So I hope this video has been useful and helpful to you, and if it has, make sure you leave me a comment below, click the like button and subscribe, and I'll see you again on the next video soon. Hi, welcome to Foods for, kind of the thing that sits the best, what the fuck is a fly in here? So how to use foods to kind of avoid, and how to get, well, how to not get dampness, damp heat, not to how to get dampness, how to, I have to do that again.